I say we start, Peter.
Okay. Um, I will hit the clock and roll. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I can't see all of you because the number of people exceeds the top of my screen. But welcome, everybody, to the very first community conversation. Our talk is sponsored by Speak for the Trees, Boston, in partnership with the Urban Program at Boston University. We're calling today's program Keeping Curious, Talking Trees. We're talking specifically about building health and resilience in Greater Boston's urban forest in the age of climate change with Trlica and David Meshoulam. I'm Peter Thompson. When I was really little, one of my favorite books was a really beautiful picture book called A Tree is Nice. So more decades later than I care to remember, that's still absolutely true for me. But it turns out the trees aren't just nice. They actually do amazing things for us, just standing there being trees. We've learned over the years that, among other things, trees also cool and clean the air. They help prevent flooding and water pollution by absorbing rainwater. They even help reduce stress, for all of which I say, thank you, trees. Today's talk is going to focus mainly on trees and the heat island effect, which for us non-academics is the tendency of dense urban areas full of asphalt and concrete and brick to hold heat, especially in the summertime. Turns out the areas without a lot of trees can be 10 degrees warmer than areas with a lot of trees. That's always been a problem, but with the hotter summers we're getting with climate change, it's going to be even more important to use every tool we have to help us stay cool. So with all that in mind, let me introduce our panelists. Trlica is a newly minted PhD from Boston University. His research there is focused on understanding temperature extremes around the metropolitan Boston area and the ability of urban forests here to help respond to the challenges of climate change. David Meshoulam is the co-founder and executive director of Speak for the Trees Boston. He's a lifelong environmentalist and science educator. He got his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's taught at Newton North High School and BU. He's also a senior fellow at the Environmental Leadership Program and a native of Cambridge. As for me, I'm a journalist and an author based here in Boston. I've been covering environment and climate issues for almost 30 years, mostly in public radio. Until a few months ago, I spent 10 years heading up the environment desk at the daily public radio program, The World, based at WGBH here in Boston. I'm also Boston native. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be exploring, like I said, Boston's urban forest in the era of climate change and the important role of urban trees in maintaining healthy and resilient communities. Drew and David will each talk for a few minutes to get us going. I'll throw it open to questions to them after that, and then we'll open things up to all of you and take as many questions as we have time for. You can do that by writing your name in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And just, if you would, please tap out a quick summary of your question, and I'll try to get to everyone. Might screen out redundant questions and stuff like that. So let's get going. Drew, you first.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Peter, and thank you to everybody who has taken the time today to think about trees with us. I can hopefully keep you at least a little entertained and get your mind off the cabin fever a little bit. I'm going to start off talking about the kind of first study that I did as a PhD student at BU. And as Peter mentioned, I was looking at the way that temperature is distributed over the Boston metropolitan region. What you're looking at here is a map of all of the towns that make up what I call the Boston metropolitan region. This is everything that lies inside of I-495. So you can think about it. This is maybe the commuter shed of the region. And, you know, and that green circle in the middle there is centered roughly over Boston Common to kind of orient you. And, you know, just looking at it right off the bat, you can see that there's a sort of red core surrounded by a kind of yellow and blue periphery. The red core, the warm colors indicate sort of higher daytime summer temperatures, and the blue colors indicate cooler. This is, you know, what we call the urban heat island effect. And as Peter said, it's a result of the physical changes that we produce in the landscape when we turn forests and fields into city. To give you an example of how big of a scale of this difference is in temperature might be, we use satellite data to gather this, to measure these surface temperature differences. And we find that in a city like or I should probably call it more like a town. I lost my ability to click here. Come on. There we go. No, 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 no. Sorry. Inevitable technical flops. Okay. In a sort of rural community like Berlin, I've actually never been out to Berlin. I don't know what it's like, but I've seen it from satellite imagery, and it looks pretty. It's like a little town square and some surrounding forest. Average summertime surface temperature is 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I apologize if I'm horrifying the science people in the audience by using Fahrenheit, but I figure it's a little more accessible. So Berlin might have a surface temperature of, say, 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the mid-morning in summer. In comparison, a place like Somerville, and this is where I was living at the time, might have a surface temperature of 102 degrees. So, like a 20 degrees Fahrenheit difference in surface temperature, which is, that's definitely enough to feel. Now, whether or not you would actually experience 102 degrees in the mid-morning in Somerville on a hot summer day, the way that we had to measure this via satellite, it may overstate that a little bit, but the difference is probably about right. So I hope that this sort of shows you that, just like in many other cities, the Boston area has a very distinct urban heat island, and it's not evenly distributed. The sort of core urban areas are considerably hotter than the sort of outlying peripheral areas. This corresponds with one of so the other thing that I looked at in this was looking at how does these temperature differences relate to the broad differences in land cover. And the one I want to talk about today is, man, this is really fighting me. Here we go. Is differences in tree canopy cover. So this map, which looks almost like an inverse of the other map, shows the fraction of the Earth's surface towns that's covered by a leafy tree canopy in the middle of summer. And you can see that in the urban core, there's kind of a hole there of not very much tree canopy cover. And if we look at the sort of same differences again, a place like Berlin would have 64% tree cover. That looks almost like a forest by sort of broad definitions of the term. And then a place like, Somerville would have as low as, 6. So that's, some really considerable differences. And, places like Somerville have very little tree canopy, and that drives quite a lot of this big difference in summertime temperature. I think, David, you might have something to add about that at a sort of finer scale, right?
I do. Thank you, Drew. The reason we're fighting is we're sharing the same mouse.
Okay.
So thank you, Drew. I wanted to zoom into Boston. Drew, I think, has some wonderful data around Greater Boston. And clearly, you can see the unequal distribution of canopy cover and heat. But if you zoom into Boston here, we can get a sense of what our urban forest looks like in the city specifically. And this is from data presented and done in a paper a couple of years ago by researchers at MIT using a combination of what's called LiDAR data and satellite data to map out our urban forest. And you can notice here that I don't know if, can you see my mouse when I move it? Yeah, all right, so you notice like there's the airport up here, there's downtown and South Boston over here, East Boston up here, parts of Allston, Brighton. You can see parts of Boston have lots of trees, and you'll have Franklin Park here, you have Jamaica Plain and the Arboretum over here, and there are areas that are much less canopied. And you can also look at exactly how that translates down to the heat corridors. And when I talk about heat corridors, I mean these areas. If you look at Hyde Park, here we have a heat land surface temperature map. That corridor right along that road there, or the corridors here that cut through Jamaica Plain, have much higher heat than areas that are forested. So like Drew said, this is really perceptible both from the sky and also from our daily experiences. It's a public health issue. It's an issue that often is a life and death issue when we face extreme heat events in the summer. So that's one way to think about what trees provide. And I wanted to touch real quick in Boston on some other ways to think about some of the benefits that trees provide. So I took the same map here from before, and you can overlay it with some flooding. And you'll notice here that Boston, because we're not far from the ocean or sitting on the ocean, we're going to be facing all sorts of issues having to do with flooding and sea level rise, both from warmer springs that will bring with them wetter and more sustained precipitation events, but also from our rising water table. So you'll notice that there are areas that are going to be very prone to flooding, and trees are really great at mitigating and slowing down some precipitation flooding that we might see. And finally, I just wanted to touch on one other thing that one other benefit that trees give us. And this is not as refined a map. It's hard to find map around air quality that's on the same scale as some of the other things that we talk about with trees. It just requires a lot more data collection. But here we have a map of sort of the opportunities to reduce pollution through tree planting. And there's clearly excess pollution in downtown Boston and up into Chelsea and Somerville. And trees in the Nature Conservancy, they had a wonderful analysis that looked at different cities and started sort of exploring how can we improve public health through tree planting. And that's something that's ongoing research right now in Boston, is thinking about pollution, reduction in air pollution as a tool to reduce things like hospital visits and asthma rates. And it's been really interesting actually in the past couple of weeks to read about the reduction in air pollution that we have right now due to just fewer people driving. And there was an article a few days ago where a professor at BU, Lucy Gutierrez, who I believe is the director of the urban program, was quoted extensively about sort of the drastic reduction that we're seeing right now in all sorts of air quality issues. So I wanted to think also about this issue of tree canopy coverage, not only through the lens of trees, but through the lens of history. And I'm going to share with you two maps here. There's been research done recently examining the relationship between what's called redlining and the persistent inequities that we face in environmental justice. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the term redlining, redlining was the practice in the 1930s through, I want to say the 60s, although to be honest, I don't know when it officially ended, although I would argue that in many ways it still continues. But it was the effort to classify neighborhoods according to their sort of desirability rating, and then encourage white families to live in more desirable neighborhoods and have people of color live in what were called less desirable neighborhoods. So here's a map of the greater Boston area, and this is a wonderful resource. It has all the cities actually across the country. A researcher, I believe in Alexandria, Virginia, collected data related to, historical data related to redlining and also related to heat. And I'll share with you, and there's a link there and I can share this with you later. But I'm gonna zoom in here on Roxbury for a minute because it's one of those communities we work with. And you'll notice here, and you might not see it on your screen, but you actually have two layers going on here. You have the color coding. So the red colors are those that are warmer, and then the blue colors are those that are cooler. And then you also have a letter that might be a little difficult to read. That's either the letter A, B, C, or D. And to the right, I've given you a key for that. So this is actually the language that was used by the housing authority. A neighborhoods are considered best neighborhoods. B neighborhoods are still desirable. C neighborhoods are definitely declining, and D neighborhoods are hazardous. So you'll notice here in Brookline, you have an A and a B neighborhood, and in Roxbury and Grove Hall, you'll have C and D neighborhoods. Immediately what pops out, right? And this is historical data that's mapped on to data that is contemporary, is that those neighborhoods that were desirable in the 1930s, those A and B neighborhoods, are much, much cooler than those neighborhoods that are undesirable neighborhoods, that are declining or hazardous neighborhoods. So what we're seeing in our urban landscape is the history, almost a century old, playing out in our contemporary public health issues, which is, I think, one really sort of sobering lesson in the persistence of inequity. And with that, I just want to turn to one more map that helps us at Speak for the Trees frame the social work as it relates to urban forestry. And we use what's called environmental justice neighborhoods. And the state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth, I should call it, takes census block data and analyzes it according to 3 different criteria. And I have them here: minority, income, and English isolation. And these are block groups that fit certain criteria. So block groups for income, those in bright green, have annual median income equal to or less than 65% of the statewide median, which is about $62,000. Those that are minority neighborhoods, which are highlighted in yellow on the map, are those with 25% or more of the residents who identify as a race other than white. And then finally, English isolation, those in bright blue or that aqua blue are 25% or more who have no one over the age of 14 who speaks English only or very well. So that's called English isolation. And then you have these other colors, the green, the pink, the bright blue, and the dark blue, which have multiple of those criteria. So immediately what you see here is Boston is a city where it's a majority city of environmental justice. And there are different levels of that. What we mean by environmental justice is those communities that, for those 3 reasons, minority, income, and English isolation, are more vulnerable for social reasons to the impact of climate change, to the impacts of environmental injustice. Maybe they don't have as much access to some of the resources. There's a history there also of immigrants perhaps, or people of limited English proficiency not being able to access some of the resources. So when we think about our work, it's an overlay between the history, the current canopy, and the environmental justice, the population as it stands today. And with that, I turn back to Drew.
Thank you, David. So I want to kind of complement what you were talking about in terms of the way that, you know, environmental and social vulnerability sort of sort in the landscape, and relate that to the work that I've done in the city of Boston about how trees sort of sort in the landscape as well too, and what that means in terms of moving forward, what we can do policy-wise about trees to maybe redress some of these things. So we're back at the map of Boston's canopy cover. This is very high resolution data, and when I was moving from my study on heat in the sort of region to what I was going to do next, I wanted to focus on specifically the way that trees in the city were producing canopy cover, so like shade, and were providing a sort of carbon sink to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And I use data very much like this to do that. And right when I was starting to consider doing this work for this project and realizing that I was living in the hottest and least tree covered part of the city, there was this big construction project along my street, along Beacon Street. And just one day, a construction crew came through and sawed down almost all of the trees along my street. And they left us with, you know, just stumps. And it was a real wake-up moment for me, because I realized that I hadn't seen those trees there until they were stumps. And I think a lot of the other people in my community had the same reaction. There were memorials that went up on some of the big stumps, you know, candles and things like that. I started noticing stumps everywhere suddenly. There were notices going up on some of the remaining trees about hearings for whether or not they would be removed. And I and other members of the community started showing up at city council meetings to sort of, you know, plea for the preservation of these trees. So that kind of motivated my thinking about this is, okay, so well, what do we have in terms of our canopy, and what can we do about expanding it, preserving it, what have you, moving forward? And what could I as a scientist do to sort of get at that question? So one of the things that I did is I took all of this tree canopy data that we had, you know, and we've got a sort of growing pile of this stuff now. Whoops, let me go back one. So the data that let me go back one, hello. So the data that I have came from 2007, an aerial LiDAR survey then that showed about 25% of the Boston city limits were tree canopy covered. This study out of MIT, and that was sort of prepared by a group up in Vermont, came down with 27%. So we'll call that about stable over time, over the last 15 or 20 years. You know, there's been ideas floated about expanding tree canopy cover. So let's talk about how we could potentially do that. So I took all of this really great high resolution tree canopy cover data that I had, as well as a sort of growing legacy of field measurements of the rate at which trees grow and the rate at which trees die in the city of Boston, very specific to the city of Boston in that sort of urban setting. And I built a computer model that had virtual trees growing in virtual blocks that I could tweak and play with over the long term to look at what sort of different policies could we implement over the next, say, 20 years that might tweak different ecosystem functions to get different services, like how much tree canopy cover can we get? How much carbon drawdown can we get to address those sorts of questions? So on the question of canopy, I compared two different interventions compared to what if we did nothing. So the let's do nothing scenario is just, we call it business as usual. It's that blue line there. And I compared that to two interventions. One was, what if we planted street trees in every possible place that we could, in a place that doesn't currently have one? And so I used some GIS to figure out where are all the streets that we could potentially plant trees on, and then say, let's put a tree there and see what happens in 20 years. And then the other one I did was, let's look at protecting the largest trees that we still have. If you think about an established urban tree, it takes decades to get large enough to really throw a lot of canopy shade. There's no amount of money that can replace them once they're gone. And yet what I saw in my community is what seemed like sort of casual destruction on some level. Like it's quite easy to remove a tree, it takes 20 minutes, but takes 20 or 30 years to get it back. So I said, what if we just stopped removing those trees? What if we lowered the sort of mortality burden on those large trees? And what came through really surprised me in that my modeling showed that if you preserve the largest trees, over the next 20 years, you get more canopy than actually really aggressively expanding the number of trees that are in the city. You obviously do get more canopy, quite a lot more canopy, if you aggressively plant more new trees. But preserving those older trees really gets you the best bang for your buck in terms of keeping that canopy up, right? So that's, that was a really interesting outcome. And I want to—
But I mean, why, Andrew, why do we even need trees?
Sorry? So we can, I'd be happy to talk about why we need trees sort of in the discussion part. Give me 2 more minutes and I'll get to the last point I wanted to make.
Okay.
The other outcome I wanted to contrast this with is, okay, so let's talk about then the potential for using our urban forest as a way of pulling some of our local greenhouse gas carbon emissions out of the air. How do these two things compare to each other? And in that case, you see these two policy scenarios flipped, in that if you add more trees to the landscape by planting all new street trees, you get more of a carbon sink over the next 20 years than if you just you try to preserve some of the larger, older established trees. Both of them, again, are helpful, but those two things are switched. So I think this sort of shows that you may need to decide, like, what is the right policy mix and where, right? Because this map shows very clearly that the needs of different communities are going to be different depending on what's already there. So that's just what I wanted to say about that. David, do you want to pick it up from there?
And how do you think coronavirus will affect the trees?
Can I just jump in for a second? This is Peter Thompson, the moderator. Please hold off on your questions until we get to the question and answer period. However, that first question that did just come in, I think points us back to something we probably ought to do. I think a number of people probably joined after my introduction. So if Andrew or David, you could please just review this question, like, who cares about trees? Why are they important in the city anyway? And also, for those of you who are not talking, please mute your mics.
So I just want to say that person who asked that question looked like he was a spammer. Because because he was asking, as I just kicked him off, was asking about coronavirus in relation to trees. I've heard that there's a lot of spammers coming through these discussions. So I will take.
But I think it might be worth just taking 30 seconds to
say why we care about trees. I mean, other than all their what we call ecosystem benefits, and I think Drew and I just laid out some, including reducing heat island effect, improving air quality, reducing stress. There's all these studies that we can see where trees have marked economic, environmental, and social benefits. So in addition to that, I think people just love trees. They're a way to build community and bring people together. And our goal as a nonprofit is to do that kind of work, is to bring people together to build strong communities where trees are celebrated. So it's not just about the ecosystem benefits or the environmental benefits or the economic benefits, but it's also about those social benefits that are embedded in community work.
David, I'd love to get back to that question of the non scientifically benefited documented ecosystem questions, but let's save that, but be sure to come back to it. But did you guys have a bit more you wanted to talk about before we get into a dialogue between you guys and throw it open to the larger audience?
I would just underline that, like, my focus on this has very much been on the carbon and the heat aspect of it. The heat aspect in particular is not trivial. I mean, Boston is not thought of as a hot city or in a hot part of the, my mind argues for a robust urban canopy because it's like it's saving lives. We know that as climate change proceeds, heat wave events, for instance, are going to get worse. And we know that they're amplified in cities. We've already seen heat wave events kill people in the thousands.
I don't know how to control this. I really apologize. I don't know how to make sure that no one comes on. Or it's automatically Andrew, you keep on talking and I'll see what I can do. Okay,
no, I mean, that was all I wanted to add. I think the control, there are obviously a host of other benefits that a healthy urban canopy and urban forest is going to bring you that are psychological, I mean, property values, pollution control, noise control, any number of things. But man, the ability to cut the tops off of those peaks in heat will save lives. And I think that's important, and save lives, particularly in places that are already at high risk, which we know are places that are economically disadvantaged. So, yeah.
I think I figured it out. I just locked the meeting. So if anyone tries to join, they no longer can.
Hopefully we haven't locked any of this.
I apologize to those people who are showing up late. But you can't join anymore, but this will be recorded. So I was not very attentive just now, but I trust what Drew said was spot on.
Thank you, David. Zoom bombing, is that what they're calling this?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, that was all I had. I'm perfectly happy to sit here and chit chat, as long as they're not, obvious sociopaths.
Can I ask a question? This is Diane. Do you have any maps on the asthma in different parts of the city that could correlate with that?
I've been looking. I don't yet. I wonder if there are any. So do you mean asthma rates, like ER visits? Because there are a couple of ways to think about it. I think it's right, where are people going to the ER, and then who has asthma at home? And no, so the short answer is no, although Drew, I defer to you. You have a study that you know of that's coming out soon that might be.
Yeah. Well, that one was 911 calls. And, I would defer to the wealth of talent that exists at the BU Urban program. There's a bunch of public health people in there that might have a lot better of an idea about that. I don't even know how that data would be collected. That's some goopy human data that I haven't really delved into very much, but it'd be fascinating to know if you could put a spatial correlation on that. Yeah.
I thought that Mass General had done a survey, but I haven't seen it anywhere.
Yeah, Larry, go ahead.
So in addition to all the benefits we're talking about, I'm interested in how decisions get made in city environments or other municipal environments? What are the decision-making processes? What's been successful in going from all of these things that we know to be good ideas to actually implementing, funding, getting enough energy, political energy behind some of the decisions that will make an environmental difference? Could somebody who has some experience with that speak to perhaps what's going on in Boston and other communities that have been successful?
I know Somerville has built up a really strong coalition of people. I know Cambridge has developed an urban forestry master plan in the past couple of years. It's actually taken them about 2 years to do that work. That was really driven by a process where residents were said, we need a task force to look at this area, look at this issue holistically. And then at Speak for the Trees, we turn a lot to partners and organizations we see across the country who are doing this type of work. So we actually have on the call today someone from the Arbor Day Foundation. I think Matt's still on. And we've been working with the Arbor Day Foundation and the Alliance and their work at Alliance for Community Trees to learn to see what other cities are doing in this area. And there is, so I'll take an example of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has an urban forestry nonprofit called KC Trees. And part of their work is the type of work that we do, which includes things like tree planting, tree inventory, tree education. But they also have a advocacy training program where they teach residents how to advocate for trees and go to hearings and advocate for more budgeting for planting and things like that. I think that's a really great model. I think the more people we get involved in doing this type of work, the more successful we'll be. I think our greatest capital is our social capital. I think the work of planting and caring for trees can be greatly enhanced if we get more people doing that work. It's a lot of work for 3 or 4 arborists in the city to do. It's a lot less work if we get hundreds of volunteers to go out, plant trees, and care for trees. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, because
Okay.
that's an important part of making it real, making it happen.
And I would add
a broader
this,
question to
Sorry.
David and Andrew. To what degree is this kind of research and this kind of reality that you guys have been pointing to in terms of overlaying your maps and seeing this very stark relationship between tree cover and temperature and the like, to what degree is that even on the radar of city governments, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, the like, the state of Massachusetts, state agencies, developers, development agencies? How much are they even thinking about this in planning what the city is going to look like, or what neighborhoods are going to look like in 10, 15 years or tomorrow?
well, I can say that the planning that the city of Boston, for instance, has been doing, and some of the broader, multi-city sort of coalitions that are working on this, they do recognize that caring for green spaces and for the urban forest is got to be a part of climate resiliency planning moving ahead. For instance, making sure that you have floodplains that are floodable and that will absorb water is a big deal for Boston, right? In my experience in working with just the Somerville City Council, a whole lot of this is there a constituency for it, right? Are there people that notice these things? If you can see the trees, then you can care about them. If you know that they're there, we have a saying in kind of the world I come from that you can't manage it if you can't measure it, if you don't know it's there, right? So if this is a community resource to be managed well or poorly, then a great deal of the question of well or poorly boils down to, is there a constituency that cares that it's managed well and poorly, and do you have eyes on it? Can you quantify what's there and where you're going?
Sorry, I lost track of the question. Oh, I know what. Yeah. So I wanted to. I wanted to return because I think there are models. I mentioned models nationally of organizations that are doing this, but I think Massachusetts actually has an interesting model that unfortunately isn't available to Boston, and that's the Greening the Gateway Cities. So this is a funding project that runs through DCR, where gateway cities, and I'll define gateway cities for you in a minute. Gateway cities can receive funding to get trees planted in people's front yards. So the DCR works directly with residents to teach them about trees, and then they show up and plant beautiful big trees in front of residents' homes. Gateway cities are those cities that are defined by the legislature as cities that are economically depressed. So it's the Hollyoaks, the Lowells, Springfields of Central and Western Mass. I would argue that there are environmental justice neighborhoods in Boston that meet the same criteria as gateway cities, but those are masked by sort of the wealth that we see in Boston, right? So as a whole, Boston is not a gateway city. There are pockets of it that would be on par with what the state defines as gateway cities. So that's one model. There's federal funds that come to this. So there's money through the U.S. Forest Service and the USDA to fund community grants. And those are, again, go through the DCR, and DCR, we've worked with them to apply for funds to do urban and community forestry projects in Boston. Those are matching grants that are run out of the state office. And then the city has money. I mean, the city spends hundreds of thousands of dollars a year maintaining its urban forest. There is a commitment to it through the Chief of Energy and Environment, Chris Cook, through Ryan Woods, the Commissioner of Parks and Rec. They have a wonderful team there. I just think that probably not enough effort or recognition from policymakers or from city councilors to really fund this as much as it should be funded.
Let me throw out another question. We've got a few minutes left here, and I'd love to take more from the other participants. But talking with you guys and just listening now, there's an interesting, it almost seems like an interesting divergence in your efforts, even though I know that both of you are working together and share a common goal. David, you focus on planting trees. Andrew, you say that your research has found that the biggest bang for the buck of our time and money is spent on preserving trees that already exist in the city. Is there common ground between those two?
I mean, I would say that I see them as very much complementary goals. You know, like, so the one of the things that I got involved with Speak for the Trees was they're organizing a citizen tree inventory. So the idea is you train people to identify trees and then go onto their block and find out what trees are there, how big are they, in what shape are they in. And I think that is a critical step one to get people engaged with the health and survival of the forest that they're depending on. You got to be able to see them first. And if you're going to preserve them, you got to know they're there. And it's about getting those eyes and getting enough people that have those eyes to be able to see the trees that are in their neighborhood, in addition to producing an incredibly valuable data set that tells us what's there, what resources do we have to deal with. And also, you know, my work shows very clearly that preserving old trees is very helpful, but planting new ones is as well too. There's a complementary move to be made there.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Drew said, I realize I can actually share that map that we've created right now. So let me pull it up for you all. What we've done, what you see here, I hope you can see it, is our tree inventory. I know Drew has been really helpful not only doing the inventory, but actually training people, as has Jess Freit. Diane has done a lot of work in Charlestown. I don't know who else is on the call right now. But let me just quickly share with you what we've done and then what our next step is here. So what you'll see is we inventoried over 5,000 street trees and about 1,700 empty planting sites. This is a fraction of the city. We think there are about 40,000 street trees, and we're only looking at street trees because what we do is we teach residents how to go out and do this work, and we're not going into people's yards. We're only going into measuring trees. And every green dot you see here is a tree that someone physically went up to and measured. So let me just pull one up here. Here's a honey locust somewhere in Dorchester. And you'll notice here we've collected all sorts of information on that tree. We've collected information on on the sidewalk, we've collected information on the planting site, and then we've collected information on the tree itself, what type of tree it is and how big it is. The program, and this is a small tree, the program then spits out what the value of that tree is. So that's a small tree, but if I found you a bigger tree, you would see that the tree actually gives you hundreds of dollars or dozens of dollars a year in annual benefits. Then we have these purple dots, which you'll see them a lot in Charlestown and East Boston, and that's because the work we've done with those communities in Charlestown and East Boston has taken place in the winter where it's really hard to identify trees. So we haven't gone through those two neighborhoods to look yet for trees. We've only looked at empty tree wells. And you click on this, and this is now an opportunity to plant a tree, right? We have everything here except the tree. So it's just an empty planting site. So now we can share with the community, hey, look, in East Boston, let's talk to the neighbors on, you know, in this block here on Chelsea Street and see if they're willing to work with the city to plant 5 or 6 trees. And maybe we could target them to request all at the same time. And then we'll do the part of the work where we can engage them. And the nice thing about this app is the moment you inventory a tree, let me see if I have it here, you can start doing what's called, nope, I guess I haven't activated it yet. You can start tracking the tree for stewardship activities. So if we were to have someone adopt a tree, they would go up and they would add information here about every time they water the tree, or every time they prune the tree, or every time they mulch the tree. And that, I think, speaks to what Drew was talking about, is increasing the longevity and health of these trees. So we see it as sort of an and, right? This platform not only engages people, not only gets more trees in the ground, long term, we're also helping people learn how to care for these trees.
So Drew and Andrew, Drew and David, we got a question from Evan about trees and sheltering in place, and to what degree you've talked about the sort of the social benefits, especially of cooling. To what degree do you think that trees can be especially important in a time like this, especially if this time continues on into the hot months, June, July, August?
I mean, if you live in a neighborhood that already has, you know, well-established mature trees, then yes, that'll help. That'll keep your house cooler, in addition to the sort of, I don't know, sort of having a tree to look at outside of your window, right? You know, there's a famous study that showed that people recovering in hospitals recovered faster if they had a window on a, you know, natural scene to look at, you know. So in terms of, you know, sheltering in place, is that helping? Is that an asset that we could rely on? Yeah, sure, absolutely. That will help the neighborhoods that have it. But it's one of these things that takes a long time to develop if you don't have
it. Just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, you spoke earlier about the psychological benefits of trees helping to reduce stress. How do we know that? And how does that manifest itself? What do trees do to help us feel calmer and less stressed out?
I really wish we had some of the public health people that could talk to this. This is way far outside of my realm of expertise. I could think of something like E.O. Wilson's biophilia, that there's an innate human draw to living things, and that we feel more ourselves when we're in the presence of those things, but I'm grasping at straws.
Yeah, I would to me, I just wave my hands and I say trees are magic.
There's the scientist for you.
Gretchen Daly, here we have a commenter that says Gretchen Daly's students on trees and mental health at Stanford.
Ah, cool.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's something that we all instinctively know is true, but I want to see the science. As a journalist, I want to see the science.
I think
so
we should
I'll definitely look at
put
Gretchen
together
Daly.
a panel on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to think if the book, The Nature Fix, which is by a journalist, it has a lot of studies. I don't recall exactly how much of it was physical health and how much of it was mental health. She spent some time in Korea and Japan where some of these initial studies were done. So there may be something in the book, The Nature Fix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is.
Thank
You're
you.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, great topic for future ones. Patrick, you have a question, and while you talk, I'm just going to throw up our last slide if anybody needs to leave early.
Hi, folks. I'm Pat Kinney from the Public Health School at BU. I'm part of a team that's been studying the health benefits of trees. And there's really an emerging literature from epidemiologic studies, but also from experimental studies. For example, putting people in virtual reality headsets and measuring their physiological reactions, their sort of psychological reactions. And even though we don't really understand the mechanisms yet, there's quite a lot of data that's emerging on the mental health benefits as well as other cardiovascular benefits of being near trees. So I'd be happy to share more of that literature at the appropriate time.
Yeah, you want to be a future speaker, Patrick?
I'd be happy to, yeah, sure.
All right, thank you for, I'll take you up on that. So I'm mindful that some people might, we're budgeted till 3:45. If you have to leave, no offense. For those of you who want to continue to speak, we're happy to stay. I'm also pushing out a poll. I hope it shows up on your screen. Just 4 real quick questions, if you don't mind answering them. And then also some follow-up items that also paste right now, actually, into our chat box. They include links to how to sign up for future sessions and just some other ways to stay in touch. So let me throw that in there for you. So our next session, we're going to transfer our sessions to Mondays at 3:30. It just worked better with some of the folks at BU. If you're interested in staying informed about future sessions, you can click on that link and just fill out your email address and sign up for our newsletter there. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And then, of course, as a nonprofit, we're always eager for donations. So those are the asks that we have. But I don't want to stop the conversation. So
we do have a hand raised from Jacques Trlica. Trlica, that looks like somebody you might know.
Yeah, that's my mom.
Okay, Drew's mom. Hello.
Yeah, what can I tell you about? Do we unmute her? Let's unmute her. Hey, Mom.
Hey, what?
You got a question?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
Laura.
I just, it's not a question. It's just, I do want to comment from a psychological behavioral comment. There are just numbers of resources available in the psychological journals. Don't forget those parts. If you want to know about how it affects humans, go into the psychological environmental journals because there's tons of it.
I was thinking about a book I saw on your shelf, The Last Child in the Forest.
Last Child in the Woods.
Okay.
Richard Blues. Yeah, filled with resources, with
Okay.
journal resources.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
That's supposed to be a really powerful book. I've never read that one.
Please
do.
Yeah. Well, maybe your mom can be a guest speaker, Drew.
Well, all right. Call her up. I'll give you her number.
Peter,
Any other?
for you.
What's that?
There's a question here for you. Oh, and I have a question from, sorry, Solia, I thought I answered your question. We have inventoried most of the trees in, I think the question was, have we inventoried the trees on Melnia Cass? And I want to say we've inventoried most of them. You can look, not all of them, I would say close to 80 or 90%. So if you go to our map, oh, another question. Do you want to just speak it, Solia? I'm sorry, I can't keep up with the chat. If I unmute you, would you ask the question?
Command A.
Are you there, Solia?
Okay, I think we're hearing you. We're hearing a new voice.
Oh, maybe not. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I see it. It says, what is the projected loss from the planned MCB reconstruction?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. So Melnia Cass Boulevard is the main boulevard that runs through Roxbury. It sort of separates Roxbury from the south end. And decades ago, it was supposed to be a highway, and the community objected to it, and sort of it remained a, it's still a major thoroughfare. Lots of trees were planted, and there are now beautiful mature trees. There's federal and state funding to go in, as far as I understand, to redo that street to try to reduce traffic. Now I'm getting, again, beyond my knowledge, and maybe Carol, if you're still on the line, you can sort of help me frame this problem. But there's been lots of efforts to resist that project because of the number of trees that are going to be removed. Last I heard, 100 trees or so were at risk. I'm not sure where that project stands now, and what the exact number is. So Carol, if you want to.
Yeah, so the project was approved, I think, about 2 weeks ago for construction. They actually agreed to approve a contract. It's one of those things that I think different people understand it different ways. Some people, the people in the city have designed this project, which some of us say is a big mistake. But you get one set of information from one person from the city, and another set of information, and we're not speaking the same language. And I guess it's far enough down the road that there's kind of an establishment position that we're going ahead with this, and it doesn't matter. So at the public hearing, actually, there was no ability for the public to comment, and it's just going to go through.
It's been how many years now, Carol, that project that's been?
Since 2011. Yeah, a long community process, and it finished without satisfying the community's concerns. But I think that it's hard to know where the support is coming from. It's not clearly an enthusiastic support, but it's a tacit support kind of thing. An idea that we do want to try some new things with bike lanes, and we do want to put some money into Roxbury, and so there we go.
And these are really beautiful trees, some of them. Most of them. I mean, they're really established. They're very thoughtfully designed.
Evan Kuras had a question about, he said, I'd like to hear more from Peter. You've been involved in environmental reporting for a long time. Oh, yeah. How have you seen the conversation about trees in the urban environment change over time?
I'm sorry to say that's not something I've really reported on for quite a long time. I mean, I certainly, I think that for people who do report on cities and humans' relationship with open space and pieces of nature that come into an urban area, there's just sort of a conventional wisdom that these things are tremendously important. And certainly I remember years ago, 25 years ago, reporting at Living on Earth on Edward O. Wilson and the biophilia effect, and on the Eden. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but basically, somebody referred to it here, bringing nature and even pictures of nature into nursing homes and hospitals, and the clear psychological effects, and even sometimes effects on recovery of those things. But I haven't been watching how the conversation has evolved over time. I mean, my sense is that there is a general realization that urban tree cover and other parts of, green space, the natural world, working their ways back into cities are tremendously important, which is why I was so shocked to hear Drew's story about his neighborhood in Somerville. I mean, Somerville has been a fairly progressive city for quite a long time. I'm shocked that something like that could happen in Somerville. My mother was involved before I was born in the effort to save the sycamores along Memorial Drive in Cambridge when they were going to broaden that into Boulevard like Storrow Drive. People have been talking about this for years, and I think they understood also that it's not merely aesthetic. So, I mean, I think in general, I would say that, these ideas have not worked their way into the common planning process and dialogue as much as they clearly should have, given what we know. That's probably not a very satisfying answer.
Classically scientific answer.
I'm seeing some new messages here, but there doesn't look like there's any questions. So the poll is up. I can see it. Can everybody else see it?
So apologies for that. I pushed it and
Okay, there it is.
it didn't show up. So some polls.
Yeah, and we'll consult.
Unfortunately, the poll doesn't allow for open answer questions. I would love any feedback. We would love any feedback. So I will populate my email address here. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts, or I would love to collect some of the resources that people shared out, and I'll send out a follow-up email with book, magazine, or journal articles. Like I said, this session's recorded, so we'll post that out as well, and we'll keep you posted on future sessions.
Yeah, David, please do share the notes and the comments as much as possible. There's some great stuff
Yeah.
there.
David and Peter, thank you very much for taking the time today, and for everybody else who's showed up to watch.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. Thanks to David and Drew, and
Thank
a lot
you,
of
Peter.
really great resources out there, clearly in this audience.
Cool. Do it again sometime.
Okay, we don't have
Yeah.
any theme music for this yet, but hopefully in
Oh
the
shoot,
future,
we need play out music. Rat.
we'll work on that.
Okay.
Not easy being green.
Were used to make the open map
Say it
inventory?
again, Richard. I'm sorry.
Does anybody know the software used to create the open map inventory? Was that ArcGIS?
It was made through a company in Philadelphia called Azavia. We just have a site license for it.
Okay, so it sounds proprietary, something you would buy.
It is and it isn't. I think what it is, and again, this is above my pay grade, is it was co-developed with Davy and perhaps Arbor Day, or maybe it was American Forest. There are a whole bunch of groups who made this open platform, and it is available freely on GitHub. But what Avia does is they sort of package it with support and with web storage to allow organizations to run it easily and cheaply without IT.
Yeah, I'm just interested in, because I'm a school teacher and we're trying to figure out ways to engage the students in this. Would be kind of a
Where do you teach, Richard?
It's in Stoneham, but the yeah, I'm sure these ideas apply everywhere, right? And just the relevance of free. And
The problem with OpenTreeMap is that it's not free. So
It's free to look, right? You
free
can
to
look at
look.
maps.
You can look at maps. Stoneham, if you wanted to get and we pay for our license for Boston proper. So if you wanted to get a license for Stoneham, there would be a cost for you. There are other platforms.
software is available on GitHub. It might be something we could download and create our own version of it.
You could, yeah. And then there's some others. I know iTree has an inventory. If you look up iTree, that's they have a whole suite of different software platforms. One of them is an inventory one. Another one's called Landscape on iTree. So just Google, it's just one word, the letter I, and then tree. They have Landscape, which allows you to sort of plant a tree next to a home and move that tree around and see what kind of benefits it will give you over time, depending on the size and location and species of the tree. There's others like it. There's Eco. There's a whole suite that iTree is consistently improving their models, developing new platforms and new ways of talking about the benefits of trees.
Great. I'll follow up with an email. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do we have the emails of Andrew?
Sure, I'll put it up in the chat window.
Oh, thank you. And also the person who spoke about the public health at Northeastern, the professor from Northeastern who.
I think that was Richard. Patrick. Was that Pat?
It was Patrick. I thought he said he was from BU, no?
Oh, BU? I don't know. I can't remember whether it was Northeastern or BU.
Raquel, I think, do you know him, Raquel?
Patrick Kinney?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so Patrick Kinney, he's a professor at the Department of Environmental Health at BU. And
Oh.
I can share his email over
Great.
the chat if that is useful for you.
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to get that myself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, someone just asked where will the slides be posted? It's a great question. We'll have to figure this all out. I realize I don't have your email addresses. I might just post them on our website and send out a general announcement. Be patient and I'll try to get it out soon. But if you want them immediately, just drop me an email. If you could, instead of in the chat window, just send me an email. My email is there, david@sfttbos.org. And I'll gladly share those with you.
David, this is Judith.
Hi, Judith.
Hi. I was at your training last fall at the aquarium. And I was
How are you?
fine, thanks. I was really looking forward to the one here in the spring. Is there any way that you could possibly do one through a Zoom, do a Zoom training? So I would love to go out there and start doing the inventory because I'm walking around all the time.
Where are you, Judith? Where do you live?
Rosendale.
Yeah. Which inventory did you do? Did you do the first one or the second one?
Oh no, see, I think the one at the aquarium was the second. The second.
I did a bunch. I did 3 or 4 at the aquarium. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought it was the second in the series, and I didn't get the first one.
Right. So we've been talking about trying to do one online with some YouTube clips as well. I would like to do that. I don't know when that's going to happen though.
Okay.
Yeah. I can't remember who I was talking to about that just recently. Oh, I know who it was. It was a group. Where was it now? Someone wanted to invite me to do it in Dorchester remotely. And the idea was that we would train people just on how to inventory empty planting sites and not to inventory trees.
Yeah.
Because that just feels easier and it wouldn't be so cumbersome to sit through a training. You could probably do it in a half hour or 40 minutes.
Right.
So stay tuned for that.
Okay.
It's an option. And if you sign up for our newsletter, I'll be sure to announce it in that.
I'm quite sure that I am, because that's how I heard about this today. Yes.
Good.
And I just wanted to say anecdotally, I was in the hospital for many days with some complications of surgery. And when I got to my rehab room, I could see outside and I started to cry. I was so happy that I could see trees from the rehab room. So they're close to my heart, really. So I'd love to be able to help.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really famous study about patients who had views of trees outside of their rehab rooms recovered more quickly and had lower rates of returning to the hospital.
Yeah, for sure.
If you go to hospital rooms now, a lot of them, if they don't have windows looking out on trees, will actually paint trees or other green as a proxy for that.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. And thank you so much, Drew and Peter. We're pulling together, hopefully, our next session on the 13th. We'll see. We don't have a topic nailed down yet, but about trees in Boston. So thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
This is great.
Take care.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thanks. It was great.